Settle in, lads. We've a big one to unpack here, huh? A big one. Olivia, what is going on? Are they headlines? Do we need to read the article, as AJ said? Where is the pushback coming from?
I mean, I think it was definitely touched on by Fiona. I think there's definitely more narrative about this. There's definitely more scrutiny on DEI. I do think that conversation is largely emanating from the US, but that makes it really relevant for us then. For those of us who have global companies, those of us who have a footprint in the US, but I think it makes it relevant for all of us because the DEI largely grew up in the US and they set a lot of those trends. And I think just to be really clear with the audience, I think this particular part of the conversation is arising because of the US Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. So where a number of colleges might have had sponsorship programs, scholarship programs, that they had a number of places reserved for women, underrepresented communities, and that was deemed unconstitutional by the US Supreme Court. And so that has been, I think, a large origin of the conversation. But I would probably argue that there has always been this level of scrutiny on DEI. So it's not particularly different now. It's always been part of our jobs as DEI practitioners to bring people with us on that journey. So that hasn't hugely changed. And I think the other thing that's really relevant is the business case hasn't changed. And Fiona touched on that as well, but the business case has not changed for DEI. That is still really strong. I always used to say, in a sea of competing priorities, it is very difficult for DEI to compete in business. But yet it has been competing for a very long time, and there's a reason for that, and that is because the business case is very strong. And I will use the Booking.com example because I think it makes it very apparent as to why that's the case. So our mission is, better remember it, is that
Write this down.
Yeah.
Write this down.
Write it down for me, is to make it easier for everyone to experience the world. And for me, that comes with an implicit commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because everyone has to mean everyone. And so our travelers, our customers are from all over the world, they're from all genders, they're all races and ethnicities, all abilities, all sexual orientations, all backgrounds, and therefore we need to make sure that our service and our product is actually serving that super diverse customer. For me, the only way to do that is to make sure that your talent reflects that level of diversity. So that's why our talent program is about attracting and engaging and nurturing that talent so that we can actually serve that diverse customer. So that's just one example of one business, and I think every business has that. So the business case is super strong, and as a result, I think DEI will be around for a very long time.
Interesting. We saw talk about the states. So Florida obviously have adopted a lot of conservative policies, and that's making global headlines. And like the sacking of the DEI team at Florida University, again, global headlines. Denis, is it happening? Is that a signal of what's to come for Europe, do you feel? Or do you think it's different in Europe?
Well, I hope it's not.
Yeah.
I'd be very similar to Olivia's views, really. I don't think it necessarily has to happen like that because of the business case. I mean, if you look, I'll build on what Fiona was saying, not to repeat things. If you take it that almost 1 in 5 people in Ireland now wasn't born here originally from here, then logically that's 1 in 5 customers. That's 1 in 5 what should be staff members or employees or colleagues. So I just don't think you can say, well, we're not going to have DEI. It's just not a realistic proposition. And the reality is, I don't think it's politicized to anywhere near the same degree here or elsewhere in Europe as it is or has been in the US in recent times. And it is. I think it was Fiona, I can't remember, no apologies, it was Fiona or AJ, but I think they put it very well. All these things go through peaks and troughs. And yes, there's a bit of a backlash now in certain places, but that's happened with every great social movement or every great initiative like this over time. So no, I don't fear for it in the same way at all. I think that maybe sometimes as well there has been some justification on the pushback, to be honest. You know, I think When we spoke before this, you know my thing of, you choose your battles to win the war, and that means not fighting every single battle. And I do think when everything's important, nothing's important. So in other words, if you focus your efforts and get real business outcomes from them, that makes the case for itself as well. So it is about finding that balance.
I'd like to come back to that point. Like, if we stand for everything, do we in fact stand for nothing? Have we created micro cults within our cultures? Back to what Olivia said about competing priorities. I want to come back to that point in one moment. But let's bring it back to Dublin. Let's bring it back to Ireland. So if that's what's happening in the States, we were with the Lord Mayor of Dublin. I'm just showing off. We were with him during the week, right? And one of our colleagues, Joe, asked him, what's been the biggest challenge you've had in the last 12 months within your term? And he said the riots that happened in Dublin. You all remember it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does not reflect our city. And it was probably one of the first times for it to happen at that scale, certainly within my living memory. So Siobhan, where are you going with this, Rob? Where I'm going with this, Siobhan?
This wasn't on the list.
No. But
Nothing was on the list.
is what's happening in our organisations simply a reflection of what's happening in society? Are they simply polarised views that have now come into our workforce? Like, how do you think, or what do you think is happening in an Irish context?
Thanks for that one, Rob.
No problem.
Do you know what I think? That society has a knock-on effect both into our lives and into our workforces. How can it not? We're so integrated now, whether that's from working from home, hybrid working, and I definitely see it having that knock-on effect. I also, just in terms of like the question and thinking about the question, I think that in terms of DE&I and some of the pushback that we're getting, whether it's through society and acts like what we saw in Dublin, I think that there's so many things at play, whether it's the headlines which AJ and Fiona talked to. I also think that there's financial pressures within organisations as well at the moment, which sometimes leads to pulling back on DE&I, whether that's the resources that are allocated or chief diversity officers being reallocated into other areas of the business, which we've seen. Also through my own research when I was doing my master's and doing DE&I and why organisations are so focused on DE&I strategies, one of the things that really came to life for me was they were doing it to be a real tick box exercise, to be part of their values or their mission statements, and there was nothing really substantial beneath that. And then obviously you have a small group within society that is playing into these headlines that are there. And what I think, for me to be really authentic and to flow into the organisation, for D&I really to live and survive, is to be part of the values of that organisation and to flow and have meaningful place in the strategies within our people agenda that we have within HR. That's where I see it truly coming to life. But in terms of what you were asking, in terms of the backlash and what we've seen in Ireland, it most definitely has a knock-on effect. I know that there was so much out there on social media about it the next day. This is not our Ireland. I know that many underrepresented folks within society felt scared going to work the next day, felt scared leaving their homes. And most definitely that feeds straight into our organisations. How can it not?
Yeah, well said, well said. And again, if I just take that into the next stage, into our world. So if it's happening in society, if it's happening amongst our workforce, how do we create the psychological safety? Because the debate in the States is free speech, DEI, tension, right? So what can we do as HR practitioners to create that psychological safety, Olivia?
I think the first thing for me is to acknowledge the importance of psychological safety. I think we maybe came to a point where we were taking it for granted and that we maybe rode slipshod over psychological safety for a long time. It is absolutely, it's very precocious and it's very precious, and we need to mind it with our lives. So the first thing is to acknowledge it, I think, because there's such an interaction between psychological safety and diversity, equity and inclusion. So high performance teams, inclusive teams are built when a psychologically safe environment actually exists. I think in terms of how we protect that, I think the first thing to do is how do we react when things go wrong? Because things will go wrong, things do go wrong, they're going to go wrong in the future. How do we react to that? And this is where I really see the correlation with diversity, equity, and inclusion in particular. So if people make mistakes, we acknowledge the mistake, we explain to them why it is that mistake, we give the example of where we've made mistakes like that in the past, the end. We move on. And I think that happens, that the correlation with DE&I is people are so afraid to make a genuine mistake. We have got to create the psychological safety for people to make those mistakes in diversity, equity, inclusion, whether it's using the right terminology, maybe afraid to use the wrong pronouns, and then people don't say anything at all. We've got to create that psychological safety so people can make genuine mistakes and they don't think that they're going to be cancelled for the rest of their natural. So that's number one, I think, is that creating that environment. And then two is really asking ourselves, who is not in the room? Who are the people who are not in the room, and making sure that we create the spaces for those people in the room. Now, when we bring in that diversity into the room, we've got to really listen to them. And we may not agree with all the viewpoints, that's absolutely fine. What we've got to be clear from a psychological safety perspective is clear as how did we make that decision in the end? How did we arrive at those decisions? Communicate that. But the two things is just to, A, not ride slipshod over psychological safety, really mind it. Create that environment so that people are not afraid to say that wrong thing, and invite that diversity of perspective into the room, and then acknowledge that, communicate about that. They're, I think, some of the big things for me.
Really well articulated, and I have ringing in my mind the voice at the table. That's what's ringing in my mind as you're speaking, and as AJ's looking at me in the front row. But Olivia, so we're going through a lot of transformation. So we have this turbulence happening. And you touch on this, Siobhan, that there's like a potential financial cost or investment to progress the agenda, which is absolutely the right thing to do. And there is a potential risk of the investment receding. In your world, Denis, you have this good thought process, I think, between minorities and majorities. How do you think about it? And practically within AIB, how do you propel the DEI agenda daily?
Yeah, so it relates a lot to what Olivia was just talking about in terms of creating the environment. So what we did over the last couple of years is we ran a campaign which then became, I suppose, more business as usual, called Universal Inclusion. And the idea behind it, which I won't say worked perfectly, but certainly seems to have worked to some degree, is we kind of invited everyone into the conversation. There's always maybe a danger that, you know, the whole DEI agenda, it's about them over there. It's not me, right? It's someone else. It's whatever group or cohort you talk about. So we really explicitly went after saying, no, this is absolutely everybody, right? Any person should be playing a role in it, but also any person could feel included or excluded at any moment in time. So that was the very deliberate play. And then we obviously articulated that in our tone from the top. I do think that matters hugely. But we really went after, and it picks up on the earlier point as well, tone from the middle. Because often tone from the top doesn't translate to what happens on the ground day to day. So we tried to go after like tone from the middle in terms of really getting teams talking about inclusion and diversity. So that was the primary call to action in those campaigns, and we've run 3 of them now, is that teams are talking about it so that they're starting to build that psychological safety and things being okay to talk about, and saying things slightly the wrong way is okay as long as, you know, you sort it out. So I think that universality was what created the bridge for us between the minorities and the masses, to use those 2 phrases, and just set up that platform for a place where people hopefully do feel safe and a sense of belonging, that they can truly bring whatever they bring to the workplace and not be worried about hiding it, even though, you know, maybe that might have happened in the past.
It's funny, I'm thinking of my kids as you're speaking, like to belong, family. I think the use of some language that we've brought into our world has now become not the case. We've let people go like that. They are not family, they're employees. And there's tension between the diversity and belonging and inclusion. And I think about my kids when they're not locked in washing machines and tumble dryers. All I hear is, that's not fair. Lily got this, Daisy got that. And it runs so deep with us, doesn't it? Fairness, like to belong, to be fair, to be heard. It's so, so important. Values, Siobhan, you mentioned values a couple of moments ago. Values is a two-way street. This is a difficult one, right? So Johnny mentioned some of the tensions in the world, the geopolitical tension that we're living through right now, right? I don't want to get into the detail and the weeds of it. But the middle manager, the mid of that pole that you mentioned, Denis, right? It's a really tough thing to express the values of your people in the society in which we exist. So how do we balance reflecting our people's values in a really difficult situation? Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's hard. It's not something that we're going to get right all of the time. For me, the one thing, though, to really lean into is to listen. To listen to those, I think regardless of middle managers or where you sit in the organisation, the one thing that I've found really powerful is taking, whether it's focus groups or a number of different people together and really listening and hearing what their feelings, what they're experiencing in the workforce. And it's not to say that you're going to be able to provide a solution to everything that you hear, but it's to take that feedback on board and to have a look at what are the barriers that people are facing in the workplace. What are the supports that aren't there at the moment? What are the systemic things that we can remove to make people come to work and do their job to the best of their abilities? And I think that's where you can really bring psychological safety in. I think that's where trust comes in to the equation, where you listen and then you give the feedback, you reflect, you talk to your leaders, you say, this is what we've heard, these are some of the solutions that we can adapt into the workplace. Because I think when we think about equality versus equity, it's not going to be the same for everybody. Everybody is going to have different needs, and it's about meeting those needs and giving the people the supports that they need to help them do the best that they can do. I think that's where we're going to get the richness out of people. Within all our jobs as leaders, I think we're going to have to make really hard decisions, tough decisions. The way the economy is gone, you have to let people go. But it's doing it in a respectful way, in an inclusive way to the best of your ability, and meeting people with that respect that they deserve.
Really, really well articulated, Siobhan, I have to say. I'd like to bring it into a very practical takeaway for everyone in the room. So we have a question in the poll. So after this, we have a look at your poll on the app. We get the results to you later on. So it asks the question, the tension between inclusion and diversity. I want to get a sense of what's happening on the ground in Ireland. But let's land it into a takeaway. I read an article 2 days ago, not in the Harvard Business Review, because I used up my 3 credits, but I read it, and it was North Face. Did you see this? North Face are giving a 20% discount to customers if they've completed and passed a free DE&I program. Isn't that brilliant? So if you're a customer, you can go on, you can do a DE&I program. If you pass, you get a 20% discount from North Face. I thought it was a very innovative initiative to propel and push the agenda forward. Can you give me a practical example of what you are doing or have done that has really helped move the dial on DE&I within your organizations? Any one project, initiative, strategy? Denis, I might come to you.
Yeah, I think it's a basic one, but the good thing is, like, obviously AIB is a large organization, right? So I would stress this will work for any size organization, and it's relatively low cost, and it's storytelling. So we have had colleagues who've come forward, and we've recorded really short videos, kind of maybe 3 to 5 minutes. So it's very practical, and these can be fairly homemade, and they don't have to be big corporate fancy things. And we did, I can't remember how many now, last year. I think it might have been maybe 10 stories, and we'd 5,500 views of those stories in 3 weeks. So very simple, very practical, but what it did is it made it real for everyone else going, this is my colleague, like this is Siobhan, you know, and then, God, I never knew that about her. And we really, again, tried to go after all aspects of diversity in the universal theme again. We didn't stick to one or the other. We said, let's try and get lots of different stories with different dimensions, the intersectional piece. And yeah, just that would be my example. And with that then, what we did do is, to build on the values piece, we did publish a really simple one-page kind of guide to inclusive behaviors. So how do you live the values? How can you be inclusive on a day-to-day basis? One page, simple infographic, and that went out to absolutely everybody. So those would be the two simple, low-cost things that I would stress.
I love the story of telling idea. How cheap is it to do it on your phone and then just share that? You know what I mean? Yeah. And it just gives a window into the individual. So there's a lot of thread wrapped through a lot of these conversations. Siobhan?
I think for me, it would be analyse and understand your data. I think that's the big one, because by leaders understanding their data, that's where solutions come from. And one of the things that I've been able to do with the different business units that we have is have programs out of them to support women, so more women in leadership positions within our organisation, and then to put a focus on those from underrepresented groups. And again, it doesn't have to be something that you're bringing in external people to have a program around. You could use your senior leadership to be sponsors to advocate for those from underrepresented groups. And you're growing your bench, you're growing your talent pool, and you're bringing people up through the ranks with you. I think it's so simple. There's so much data out there that we have within our organisations. It's using it in the right way to make powerful and meaningful change.
Yeah, really, really good. And I'm reminded of Bono. I keep on using this phrase, factivism. Use the data, use the fact to activate the change. Yeah. It's a really, really important thing. And I'm actually encouraged by like the over 55s. I know Lindsay's here and she'd have a specialism in this space. Like there's been a big kind of light shone on that cohort. And I think we've made really good progress in that space. So I'm really encouraged by that. Olivia, final word.
I will absolutely answer the question in terms of what do we do, but I also want to talk about what we don't do.
Please do.
Because it's centred around the debate and the constancy of the debate, and also about that kind of minority-majority piece that you asked about. And I think we really need to acknowledge the impact that constant debate has on the underrepresented communities. And while it's important that we can have hard conversations, we have to remember that has a real impact on the persons that we are talking about, whether that's women or underrepresented communities. And we saw that really play out in the marriage equality referendum here in Ireland. We've got such an example of that. Yes, it was this huge liberation movement. Yes, it was this great catharsis for the country. But actually, it had a huge impact on the people who were the subject of the posters on the lampposts that they were telling them that they were not worthy to be parents. So we have to really acknowledge the impact that the debate has in the first place. And while we can have the conversations, we need to have them in that very respectful way. And that particularly impacts underrepresented communities. So that's kind of in that what we don't do space as well. I think that's often as important. But in terms of what we do, like I do think still setting goals, and that's probably very relevant to this conversation, because in terms of where there has been the pushback, it's been around the setting goals. And it's still important to set those goals, even if you're only making incremental gains. There's still incremental gains that are really important for women, really important for underrepresented communities. So set those goals, and then if you are going to set the goals, then you do need the data. And we have strayed a little bit from diversity data because we're a little bit fearful around GDPR. You know, I'll say simply, it's not without complexity. You know, as in you could say it's a complete pain in the hoop to do it, but actually it's super important that you do. And we do have to collect that diversity data. And, you know, I've done it in 2 organizations now, 2 big global organizations, and you can store and collect in a way that is GDPR compliant. And then when you've done those 2 things, I think intersectionality, intersectionality, intersectionality in everything that you do. All of your programs, mentorship, sponsorship, all of your eventing, to apply that intersectional lens so that, again, we are asking who is not in this room, and the equity piece. AJ talked about, you know, banging down that door, but we also have to, equality is probably opening that door to everybody. I think equity is creating very specific pathways to that door for the people who have not started in the same place, and that remains still important.
In case you didn't hear, intersectionality, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Olivia. I'm reminded the lens you mentioned, the voice at the table. I think it's important to have a third lens, because if the privilege is invisible to us through our lens, we can't empathise or sympathise. And what I'd often say to our folks, and I've said over the years to my colleagues in Sigmar, was to visualise your most vulnerable loved one and to hope how they were treated in that scenario, to use that as your baseline for how you behave to another individual. Because to see it through that lens gives you real empathy. And the action you take based on that is compassion. Ladies and gentlemen, were they fantastic? Please thank them.